The Bond report, they did another report following that Megatrends report called Fast Forward, which came out last month, where they tried to look at this was something they did for DFID, trying to look at the contribution of the UK NGO sector for the UK. And so they ran through some of the, where it contributes. But also they then tried to identify what are some of the strategies that they should be building on, and quite clearly the diversity of the sector. And that's quite contradictory. I mean, again, if you talk to people in DFID, particularly the civil society part, they would like to deal with far fewer NGOs. They'd have a rather Soviet view of it. Much easier to just fund 100, put it through a PPA or something like that. But there is this very diverse sector, as I say, at least 12,000 UK INGOs of various sizes. And the Bond point, let's build on that, let's look at different ways of reshaping civil society. But I think one of the really interesting ones is this shift away from being operational, directly operational, to much more of an enabling role. In other words, picking up on that point of disintermediation, that the role of the northern entity is as a knowledge broker, as a resource provider, expertise, but enabling southern organisations to go, forget being directly operational. So some interesting issues there. Quite clearly some major concerns, all the data says we've got to rebuild our connection with local constituencies, etc., etc. And they end up with this very clear point, we need leadership that's fit for the future. And the debate is, what does that look like? And we'll come on to that in a second. Berko Garang, who runs the International Centre of Civil Society in Berlin, was the chief executive, SAVE, for a while, and has been around the sector. Recently published this book, which actually you can download on the web. It's called The Hedgehog and the Beetle. The first 100 pages are pretty hard work, but actually it gets more interesting once you get past about page 150. But one of the things that comes up there is his argument is for northern NGOs, for INGOs, is they've got to be reinvigorate themselves as activist organisations. Take on a much more an advocacy, much more of a political role. Whereas Bond is being more sensible and more conservative. It's about enabling and whatever. I mean, people like Garang saying, and that they need to be much more accountable internationally and work out international ways of wiki accountability, etc. And clearly, also the way they operate, they need to speed up their decision making. I was very struck by this quote that they're over-governed and under-managed. Really interesting comment on that. The amount of time that it takes NGOs to make decisions and who we've got to refer to, but I better go and check with Gladys, and then somebody's got it, and it goes on forever. What his point is that we've got to address this, we've got to streamline our systems, we've got to embrace digital, and above all, he picks up this point about the culture of harmony. There have been a number of reports recently about the performance culture within NGOs and the failure to deal with poor performance. There's a report where they talk about the culture of mediocrity. It's a really hurtful one. But there are some real, if you look at people in aid and their surveys, much the same thing comes out. And clearly there has to be something about leadership within NGOs dealing with performance issues. The people in aid research suggests it's not that it's partly because we're nice people and anyone working in NGO and the voluntary sector has to be a really nice person, we never want conflict, but it's partly that. So there's something about that culture, but there's also something clearly that people in leadership positions really have had very little formal training to deal with underperformance. I think there's some real issues about the whole performance agenda. So you've got a recent perspective, which is the Bond one, perfectly sensible, perfectly reasonable, slightly more conservative, and then you've got something like Garang taking on a much more advocacy, sort of harder-nosed route to it. But both of them, in sense, saying the same thing: NGOs have to change. The context we're operating in is sufficiently tricky, sufficiently difficult. Things have got to change. The needs are changing, the problems are changing, etc., etc. And I do think this Dornbach's law is a really useful thing to remind them. Just shove it on your wall. He was an economist at MIT, And it really resonated when you look at the financial crisis in 2008. You know, they take longer to arrive, but my God, when they do come, you've got to be very fast-footed to handle that. So I think there's a, so you know, what is it that the strategic capabilities that we're talking about that people in leadership roles need to be fulfilling in? When we talk about strategic capabilities, and we're talking about things that are the broader assets, the organisational assets that enable you to deliver the mission. And certainly I think, you know, the language we traditionally use has been about skills, it's been about competencies, and we need to be talking much more in terms of capabilities to cope with this changing environment that we've been touching on. It's the building blocks of your strategies, it's that enable you. And traditionally as a sector, in both, you know, the NGO sector and the multilateral and the bilateral sector, we focused on tangibles. You know, it's been about money, it's been about putting in place systems, and all these ridiculous debates about single programming and federal structures and confederal structures, and should Action Aid be a Dutch stiftung, or should it be based in Joburg, or should Oxfam International be in Bangkok, or is it going to go to Kenya, and what does a confederal structure look like, what's a, you know, and that's, we've spent a lot of time obsessing about that, we've been obsessing about money, very little in terms of some of these intangible capabilities. And again, one of the things that's very clear, if you look at the mainstream research, is the importance. You look at people like Dave Ulrich, the importance of intangible capabilities. And I just tried to put some up there that I think are, and certainly from my work, that are worth highlighting. Quite clearly, there's something about being a value-driven. You know, it's about our identity. How do we reinvigorate our value set? Well, the thing that makes us specifically distinct. I mean, the idea that, say, the children should actually be trying to emulate, you know, Serco, which is what I've heard from one of their strategy people, I find just extraordinary. Eccleston Begg would roll in her grave. You know, Serco, service providing, government contracting, they run prisons, all sorts of issues. And the idea, you know, where are the values? Where are the traditional values? They are a key capability. Clearly our relational capabilities. How do we build collaborations? How do we do co-creation? Absolutely key. You know, in this changing world, this brokering world, we have expertise, we have funds, we have knowledge, we have values, but we don't necessarily have that contact in the community. There's something about that relational world. Clearly in terms of mobilizing talent and expertise, we as knowledge organizations. And you can go down that list. There are a whole bunch of capabilities out there that are relatively intangible, that are absolutely clear of what the sector needs and what NGOs, and I would argue also donors, need in terms of building their capability. And this whole thing about demonstrating agility, it's the speed of decision making, it's the ability to change strategy in face of different circumstances, different data, whether it's the financial crisis, whether it's what's happening in Syria, whether it's an earthquake in Haiti, or whatever it may be. There's clearly issues about agility. And linked to that is this whole thing about smart working. And I just want a little quick detour, because I really feel that for our sector, smart working, you know, we've got obsessed by language about effectiveness and efficiency, and Gates, if you work with Gates, they're very keen on execution, which is really fitting for this sector. You know, how are we executing things? But there's something in terms of this smart working, and I just want a quick detour into that. It's about building on what we actually, as a sector, we've always done. It's been about autonomy, it's been about collaboration, it's about optimizing tools. It's about doing things differently, thinking about the way we work. We've got new technologies, we've got much more talk about freedom of action, we've got people working around the world in different autonomous entities. We need much greater organizational flexibility. I mean, none of this, for anyone working either in a donor organisation or in an NGO, would say that's not what we're doing. Because we're having to operate out, we're having to work in very different ways, and particularly with new technology, that's what's happening. And I think we do need to embrace this and understand what it means in terms of working practices, in terms of structures and systems. And it's much more about flexible working systems. It's about accepting these new work paradigms in terms of, you know, self-management, in terms of greater degrees of autonomy and empowerment, you know, all that traditional language that we've so used in the sector, importance of virtual team working. Anyone who's doing working internationally will understand, you know, the importance of team working, all those elongated Skype conversations or teleconferences that suddenly break up halfway through because, you know, whatever it may be that go on there. Clearly we are a sector that has lots of KPIs and indicators, and so that needs to be factored in there, and we understand that. Different locations, different hour systems, etc., etc. And you know, for all that to work, there has to be high levels of trust. There have to be some common values. And one of the interesting things that's come out of 2008 and the financial crisis in the mainstream research has been the importance of trust. And how do we rebuild trust? Trust, which was a nice thing when I did my MBA. Oh, it's nice to trust your boss. You know, clearly now it is seen as a core capability. It's seen as something that is central to organisations. So that's the context we're operating in. And if you can bear with me, having done that, I just want to get you to think a wee bit about, therefore, the leadership issue. What is this future fit leadership? What is this sort of leadership that we should be looking for, if that's the context we're operating in? How do we ensure, how do leaders ensure that NGOs have those capabilities to handle those, for new working practices, new ways of working? When we talk leadership, it is crucial we recognise that it's not just about an individual, it's about the relationship of others. You know, that we can't talk about leadership without followership. And absolutely central, all the traditional literature on leadership was, you know, this is what Napoleon did, this is what Montgomery did, this is what Eisenhower did, what these military characters. Very much about the individual, but it's quite crucial that when we think about leadership within that. And I think what we also recognise, when I first started in this game, leadership was hardly mentioned. By 2000, what we saw much more recognition of the importance of leadership, people making the investments in leadership development. Has it achieved what we hoped? Question mark. Are we going down the wrong route and we're focusing on leadership development, and maybe we should focus much more on recruitment and selection, better job descriptions, better ways of doing recruitment? Maybe we should be dealing with this poor performance issue, giving people in leadership roles better skills to deal with poor performance. And also we need to recognise that when we think leadership, it doesn't necessarily guarantee success. There are a lot of people in quite senior positions in fairly nameless INGOs who really shouldn't be there, and almost should not have been there, and we know the consequences of that. So there is that. So again, the question is, what is effective NGO leadership? So you can see the voyage I've taken you through. There's a changing context out there. The mega trends, there's some particular issues that I think NGOs are struggling with and facing. There's some issues in terms of the way we work and the way work is operating in an international cross-cultural setting. So what is it that we need, and how do we need to rethink leadership in that context? And there's no point in talking about leadership unless we understand that context. And I think that would be one of the lessons that I've learned over many years. Don't just send something in the leadership program. It's about leadership. There has to be within some context.